You might think that the concepts surrounding race and racism have been around forever. The truth is, though, that the concepts of race and the categories of black and white are not only relatively new, but were created for a very specific reason. Welcome back to another episode of Anthropology in 10 or Less, your basement-based source for anthropological inquiry. I'm Michael Kilman, and today we're going to cover the second part in our multi-part series on race and look at where the modern concept of race and racism come from. There's a false assumption out there that the concept of race and racism have always existed in the world. The truth is that while discrimination has probably always been present throughout human history, the concept of race that we have today definitely wasn't. Humans do have a tendency to create in-groups and out-groups, but those groups have changed radically over history. There's nothing natural about using skin color as a marker for difference. Just ask the Irish. In the mid-1800s, the Irish were not considered white. In fact, they were sometimes called Negroes turned inside out. Germans, Jews, Italians, Greeks, Spanish, and others who we consider white today weren't always considered white. The lack of amount of melanin in your skin, which again results in light skin color, didn't necessarily make you white. So where then does the concept of whiteness and blackness come from? What about race? Well, while it can be a little bit murky in the exact origin, we have a few pieces of evidence that point to a radical shift in our thinking about race. In order to understand our modern concept of race, we have to go back in time to the 1600s, in both the Virginia and Maryland colonies. Between 1607 and 1682, about 92,000 immigrants were brought here to these two colonies alone. About 69,000 of them were indentured servants, that is, people who treated a term of labor to pay for their trip to the Americas. These contracts often included a guarantee of freedom and a land grant after the contract was fulfilled. It is really important to understand that while many of these laborers were British, there were also laborers from African nations, Portugal, Spain, France, Turkey, and Ireland. These laborers lived, worked, ate, and slept together in the exact same conditions, regardless of skin color or geographical origin. In fact, indentured servants of African descent earned their freedom just like their European counterparts. At that point, both Africans or Europeans were allowed to own land, vote, run for public office, testify in court, own slaves, own indentured servants, and marry any person of the opposite sex, regardless of skin color. In short, there was no distinction based on skin color. But in the mid-1600s, things changed. There was a huge shortage of females in the colonies. In fact, there was a 10-to-1 ratio. The wealthy white landowners created a law in 1664 to prohibit marriage between British women and slaves. What we would consider interracial marriage today was both a common and accepted practice. In fact, records from the 1660s show that almost a quarter of all children were born to European women had mixed ancestry. But in the mid-1660s, several other factors changed. 1. There was a labor shortage. The flow of indentured workers had started to slow significantly, and as a result, landholders began to turn to an increased slave population. 2. Conditions between both indentured servants and slaves became much more harsh. For servants, even a minor infraction would increase the term of a labor contract, sometimes for years. And even when those labor contracts were up, there was little or no land available to be granted them as per their contract. Because at this point, most of the land was either taken over by friends of the king or the wealthy elite. 3. Tobacco prices fell as the number of farms producing it increased, which caused the local economy to suffer and worsen the living conditions in the colonies. While it's true that slaves were clearly at the bottom of the totem pole, the living conditions for poor servants had also become severe. 4. In 1670, a law was passed that removed a vote from anyone who did not own land, further restricting newly freed laborers from changing policies that might discriminate against them. And 5. Along comes a man named Nathaniel Bacon, who united these groups to fight back. Now, Bacon was no saint. As a white landowner, he had his own agenda, and in 1675, Bacon developed a plan to take land from several Native American tribes in the area in order to acquire land for himself and his supporters. But the ruling class refused to allow their militia to help attack the Native American population. In retaliation, Bacon began a public campaign against the wealthy and criticized their treatment of the poor. He convinced some small landowners to join him. He demanded an end to slavery and made false promises of amnesty to slaves. And then, finally, after a year of planning and building a coalition, Bacon united the servants, slaves, and the poor landowners against the wealthy elite and Governor William Berkeley. On September 19, 1676, Bacon and his coalition burned the colonial capital of Jamestown to the ground. Governor Berkeley fled across the river. Later, he returned with a fresh contingent of British troops and took back the city. Some of Bacon's followers were hanged, but Bacon himself died of dysentery before Berkeley regained the city. So why are we talking about a class uprising? Well, because these events changed everything. The rebellion scared the hell out of the wealthy elite, and the first thing they did was to begin phasing out the use of servants and began recruiting slaves from deeper in Africa who had no experience with the English language. This prevented effective communication or resistance. But still fearful, the wealthy elite and local lawmakers relied upon a divide and conquer approach. Over the next few decades, they passed a series of laws that created categorical differences for all new colonists. Those laborers of European origins were given more privileges and rights than those laborers of African descent. This later came to be known as a racial bribe. Servants' contracts were now honored, and they were insured land at the end of their terms. In 1681, we see the very first law that creates the categories of white and black to mark the distinction between the two populations. In the decades that followed, many laws were created. Free blacks were no longer allowed to hold office. Their right to vote was removed. Blacks were no longer allowed to testify in courts against whites. Blacks were no longer allowed to possess weapons. Blacks could receive public lashings for raising a hand against any white person. And over time, most free blacks found themselves in slavery as a result of minor legal infractions. On the other side, free whites were granted greater access to Native American lands. White servants were allowed to police slaves, and barriers were created between the areas where they had previously cohabitated. This gave the poor whites a perceived stake in the control of the colonies. Though their conditions did not actually change much, the wealthy elite had convinced them that it had through the creation of the categories of black and white. Through this, the concept of race was born, and it was born for the specific purpose of controlling the poor. In other words, the concept of race was born as a tool of class control. I should note, in many ways, this hasn't gone away, but we'll talk about that in another episode. By the 1750s, there was a culture born in the colonies and in Europe that fostered the idea of racial superiority. White supremacy was born. This coalesced when the botanist by the name of Carl Linnaeus began the creation of taxonomies. Now, Linnaeus was really important in biology and science because he realized that in order for science to progress, we needed clear-cut classifications of plants and animals. Kingdom, class, phylum, order, family, genus, species. Kingdom, class, phylum, order, family, genus, species. Man, my 7th grade biology teacher, Miss Dalton, would be proud that I still have that memorized. But when Linnaeus finished with plants and animals, he looked at human beings. In 1767, he published a book called Systema Naturae. In the first volume, he classified 4 distinct species, or races, of man. He later added additional categories, but here are his first 4 classifications. Homo Afer, from Africa. Their qualities were described as black, phlegmatic, relaxed, crafty, indolent, negligent, anoint self with grease, and governed by caprice. Homo Asiaticus, from Asia. Their qualities were described as sallow, melancholy, stiff, severe, haughty, avaricious, covered with loose garments, governed by opinion. Homo Americus, from the Americas. Their qualities were described as red, caloric, erect, obstinate, merry, and free, paints self with red lines, regulated by custom. And finally, Homo Europaeus, from Europe. Their qualities were described as white, sanguine, muscular, gentle, acute, and invented, covered with closed vestments and governed by laws. Now, to be fair, Linnaeus didn't invent these ideas on his own. Most of them came from the American colonies where the concepts of race and racism were born. But Linnaeus did help to make race, quote, scientific. And the horrors that followed became justified by, quote, science and reason during the Age of Enlightenment and beyond. But before we go today, I want to be clear that while science was used to further racism for many years, it was in fact science, specifically genetics and physical anthropology, that have shown us that the concepts of race and racism have no factual basis. But we'll cover that in a future episode. In the next part of our series on race, we'll explore race in the 19th century and the rise of things like the eugenics movement, human zoos, and social Darwinism. See you next time. Hey again, if you really like this show and you want to see more than 1 or 2 episodes go up a month, then we need your help. Visit our Patreon support page and consider becoming a supporter. Even pledging $1 an episode would make a huge difference. If you support us, you'll get benefits like being able to participate in Q&A episodes, and at higher support levels, you can get some really awesome swag. And if you even support us enough, we'll let you choose a topic of an episode from any of the 4 fields of anthropology. So, consider supporting us today. Thanks.